Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. On his first visit to India at the end of 1950, Australia's Prime Minister Robert Menzies said on a broadcast on All India Radio, "There are common principles, ideals and methods which we share, quite irrespectively of the obvious differences in our historic and cultural backgrounds. For the Australian visiting India, there is much common ground to be found. It is pleasing to us and I believe pleasing to you." Today, the importance of India to Australia cannot be overstated. It's one of the largest sources of our migrants, and our strategic posture and relationships such as the Quad put India front and centre of our thinking. But in the Menzies era, with a newly independent India taking a leading role in the non-aligned movement, things were not so straightforward. Robert Menzies and Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru famously did not get on. Despite this, for the early part of the Cold War, India was Australia's largest aid recipient. Joining me to discuss Australia's relations with India during that time is policy analyst Dr. Teesta Prakash. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Teesta.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, great to have you on the podcast, and great to have a bit of a contest of ideas here, because we have in the past had Dr. Meg Gurry on the podcast talking about exactly the same topic, but with a different perspective. So I'm really interested to hear your take on Australia-India relations in this sort of early Cold War period, and the importance or not of the Menzies-Nehru relationship or lack thereof. So, Teesta, I thought we might just start off by considering, why is there this impression that Australia really ignored or neglected the relationship with India during that Menzies era?
Not just for the Cold War period, I think from Menzies, Nehru, moving on to the Rajiv, Bob, Hawke era to the Morrison, Modi era, there's always been a big focus of the Australia-India relationship analysis is derived from the chemistry or the lack of the chemistry of these leaders. And that's really what Meg Gurry's work and most of the scholars who work in this area really focus all their energies on. And rightly so, right? Because initially, especially during the Cold War period, leaders carried so much personality and they carried so much almost unchallenged power within their cabinet. You can say that for Menzies and Nehru at least. But I think there's this current debate, or I wouldn't say current, but ongoing debate about Menzies. Was there an animosity towards Nehru, or was it for disinterest towards Nehru? Because they're very different topics. The animosity argument obviously stems from the fact that there was just this basic difference in how they viewed the world, in that Menzies was very British to the bootstraps, pro the English era of Asia, whereas Nehru was the leader of this newly sprung decolonized state that was very young and obviously struggling with modernization and development. But they viewed the world from very opposing lenses. And so that it really fits very neatly to the narrative of animosity. But when you really dig into what really Menzies did, you'll find it's very complex. So it wasn't that Menzies was disinterested. So for example, the Kashmir issue, especially in the early 50s, Menzies was really almost hell-bent in trying to find a conclusion to it. And obviously, the reason why he was so invested in the issue was from the perspective of the Commonwealth, because he did view that the Kashmir issue could potentially destabilize the Commonwealth. So it wasn't pure disinterest from Menzies' side. And, his foreign minister, Percy Spender, was really invested in trying to come up with a solution to how to solve the Kashmir era. Obviously, we know that hasn't happened. But 11 suggestions and solutions that were presented to Nehru, all that were not taken very well by Nehru, but funnily enough, all of them were accepted by Pakistan. So there was a lot of effort put in by Menzies, especially during the early 50s era, so very fresh when India had just gained independence. But there's the scholars who also argue from the notes of his high commissioners. Walter Crocker, in his book, mentions that in 1959, when Menzies was visiting India, he didn't even ask any questions about India to Crocker. So I think it was, to me, my personal analysis here is that there was significant interest, but it just got beaten out of him. He just got weathered down by just how complex India is and how solutions are very complex. And not to mention, time was not on his side. Personalities in the Indian cabinet were definitely not on his side. Not just Nehru. We always like to talk about Nehru versus Menzies, But we forget that Nehru had VK Menon. He had a lot of people who were supporting him who also didn't like Menzies. So it wasn't just these two men and these two countries. It was a structure. It was a system. It was the supporters on each side. People always like to question, was it Australia that was struggling or was it India that was struggling to see each other? But I would just say it was wrong timing and just bad situation. And the structure in international relations, as we like to call it, right? The structure versus agent problem. They were both against a strong Australia-India relation. So tough luck.
Yeah. It is worth reflecting on the fact that just a year after Menzies was elected Prime Minister, so elected the end of 49, just a year later, he's making the first visit of an Australian Prime Minister ever to India in the end of December 1950. The quote I read out, he speaks very warmly about what he thinks are the shared values. There is shared heritage, there's also very different heritage, but political system, the new Indian constitution had made reference in the formation to Australia's democratic system, so there were learnings and of course, Menzies being, I think, the greatest fan of cricket of all our prime ministers, even exceeding that of John Howard, that would have been a wonderful, soft part of the relationship with very much shared interest there. So there was a lot to draw upon in terms of we can understand each other's perspectives from having similar frameworks and governance frameworks and influence of the British on our systems. But do you think in terms of the Nehru-Menzies relationship, was it just because they saw the world so differently, or do you think there was some kind of interpersonal clash?
It's really difficult to tell, right? Because like I said, at the beginning of the relationship, Menzies was really interested in, and the whole thing about my thesis is that despite this, I don't know, you want to call it dissonance, antipathy, discord, whatever you want to call it, Australia was giving 2/3 of its aid to India. Right? That would not be possible if the Prime Minister is not signing off on it.
Well, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So, I mean, just speaking very simplistically, of course. But I think it was essentially just from a very scholarly perspective, I think it was a structural issue. This was a bipolar world, and you're either here or you're there, right? And probably we'll discuss it a bit later, but India didn't fit into either camp initially, right? It was a parliamentary democracy that was doing a partially planned economy. So it was catering to both sides. And as a result, it wasn't on either side.
That's right. And it was an us, as you say, it was an us versus them mentality back then, wasn't it? So you were either with the West or with the Soviet Union and global communism. And India's choice to chart a non-aligned path, the middle road, for someone like Menzies, who was definitely on the side of the West and liberal democracies with the United States, was completely counter to what he believed in, and of course was not at all taking seriously then, if you had a non-aligned point of view, the threat of global communism as he perceived it.
Precisely. It's a lot easier now to walk that middle path, I believe. A lot of Southeast Asia, South America, South Asia, they're all doing it, but India was the OG, we're going to stay in this area and we can't really pick a side. And there may be, a lazy reason to it or a strategic reason to it or whatever reason to it, right? But that's what it was. And it was structurally difficult for Menzies and Nehru to see eye to eye, essentially.
It's interesting, in the Menzies collection, there's a book given by Nehru to Menzies, and it's a book that Nehru himself had written, The Discovery of India. I think he wrote it while he was in British Raj, had put him in jail for his independence activities. And so he'd written this book. Anyway, he presents it to Menzies. There's a very simple inscription. I can't say it's very heartfelt. I think it's pretty much from Jawaharlal Nehru or something like that. It's pretty superficial. The book is an old publication, so the pages need to be cut as you read it. And it's interesting. It's been noted by an academic here at the University of Melbourne that only the first 4 or 5 pages have been cut. So the evidence of Menzies reading it would only be to, say, 4 or 5 pages in. And just when Nehru starts to get really stuck into the Raj and criticise the British, Menzies has stopped reading. Whether that is the reason he stopped reading, or maybe he just lost interest, or maybe he ran out of time, we don't know, but you can draw our conclusions.
And I think this was given towards the end of the 50s, and that's when the relationship had really soured. So I think in 1960, at the United Nations General Assembly, Nehru pushed for a resolution to meet the superpower meeting where all the non-aligned states would meet. And Menzies basically blocked the resolution. And it wasn't very nicely the way that he did it. And there was a war of words between Nehru and Menzies. So it's like any relationship that if you continuously have roadblocks, you're going to end up in a not in a nice place.
Yeah, yeah. So we can think in 1950 when he was delivering that broadcast on All India Radio, things could have gone differently, the relationship. But by 1950, 1960, things were pretty sour. Teesta, you mentioned before the importance of the leader-to-leader relations in the Australia-India relationship. And I think it's true. Because the relationship is not a deep one, those leader-to-leader exchanges are actually really important. Whereas if you think of leader-to-leader is important for our relationship with Britain, of course, US, France, Japan. But because those relationships are so deep, there are defence links, there are huge economic links, people-to-people links, cultural links, on so many levels of society that even if the leaders don't necessarily admire each other or get on that well as people, it doesn't really matter that much. The relationship can withstand a difficult relationship because your economies are so intertwined or your culture is so intertwined or you have so many of each other's people in each other's countries. So there's ballast to it. Whereas with India, do you see that leader-to-leader relationship, because of the lack of ballast, being so critical?
Initially, so during the Cold War period where we didn't necessarily have migrants because of the White Australia policy, we didn't really have an economic relationship either. India was quite low on the export list. What really mattered, though, in this time was the diplomatic appointments. So Australia's diplomatic appointments, and specifically the sequence of sort of Walter Crocker, then Peter Hayden and James Plimsoll, and then finally Arthur Tang.
For most people, those names won't mean much at all. But if you're in Australian diplomacy, they are big names. They are really significant figures. So Australia wasn't just sending any old hack to Delhi. They were sending the most experienced, serious diplomats.
That's exactly what I was coming to. Of course, they went to India, but it was more important what they did when they came back, right? So, for example, Arthur Tang, he was the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs. Then he was, due to some disagreements with Menzies, was packed off to India. And then when he came back, he became the Secretary of the Defense Department. It's interesting that the career graphs of the diplomats that were sent to India, they were top quality. India didn't necessarily return the same quality.
Ah, that's interesting.
Which it's not saying something explicitly, but implicitly it's implying that Australia wasn't the top priority. The best ones went to the US, to China, to USSR. India's focus, rightly so, I mean, in the sense that the competition that it saw, the geographic proximity to these communist blocs of USSR and China, its strategic importance wasn't necessarily towards Australia.
Well, I think India also sees itself as a great power, doesn't it? And would see Australia as, well, a middle power, fine, and important-ish, but you wouldn't necessarily send your best diplomats if you're a great power to a middle power unless you had some particular strategic reason to do so.
I mean, it's all changed now. Australia has really risen in the ranks of importance and who they're sending here. Moving away from the political heads, if we were to look at who the diplomatic communiques were, I think they were of significant importance. And that's what my thesis looks at is the importance of bureaucrats, importance of diplomats in shaping policy.
It's really interesting. As you say, almost a continual theme, the personalities are what matters here, maybe more so than the issues. So India is the leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. It'd be worth understanding, Teesta, why it chose that path, why it didn't side on the side of liberal democracies, or it, of course, once Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister, it started to get a little bit closer to the Soviet Union, so it could have sided with the Soviet bloc. So what was the benefit for India of being the leader of the NAM and part of the NAM movement?
So I think we need to differentiate between Nehru's NAM, so Nehru's non-alignment, which basically he started, and then to Indira Gandhi's non-alignment, which is very different to Nehru's understanding of non-alignment. So to start us off, I'd like to say that when the non-alignment movement at the Bandung Conference in 1955, the circumstance for India was that it was a young nation that was struggling to cope with sort of problems of modernization with the immediate heritage of a colonial past, right? So there was impending problems of how to solve a development problem, how to make sure that a communist country that is sitting on your border isn't taking up your territory. And the answer to these problems was that India needs to be strategically autonomous, right? It has to guard its independence. It's just come out of a British colonial rule, so it cannot go back. So it was a survival mechanism, essentially, to make sure that it doesn't have to go into a hostile camp. It was a self-determination act. Like I mentioned, geographic proximity to both the USSR and China really pushed on the fact that India needs to be its own entity. And like I said initially, it was India just didn't fit in either camps. Its development process, partially planned economy with the private companies and the public company coming up together, it was rare. It doesn't make sense. It still doesn't make sense. It's when you try to understand India's development planning, it was very pro-socialist planned economies. But at the same time, there were private industrialists. It wasn't making sense. And for them, the best way to forge in this bipolar world was to make sure that they stand on its own.
That's sort of an Indian exceptionalism, though, do you think? I mean, they obviously led a movement that was bigger than just India, and there would have been many nations who had the same view. They didn't want to take a side. They wanted to chart their own unique individual course through the Cold War. But India does, even with the Quad these days, there's things India is prepared to go along with. And then when it comes to Ukraine, has a different point of view from its Quad partners. There are not always relationships that India has aren't always as straightforward as, say, the perspective Australia brings to its relationships in terms of commitment to a certain ideological position or at least a conception of the preferred global order.
That's primarily because commitments equal constraints, right? So when you commit to something, an alliance, a policy, it then constrains your policy rubric that you can only do within this from here to there. When you don't have this commitment, you can do whatever that fits your strategic interest, right?
So essentially, it was a flexible approach then.
Absolutely. And one could even say that moving forward, Indira Gandhi's non-alignment movement, which saw a lot more closeness to North Vietnam, to USSR, this flexibility allowed India to get close to sort of powers that a commitment wouldn't have. And then as we see, Indira Gandhi comes to power in 1966, that India is now the sole balance of power holder in the South Asian subcontinent, right? After 1971, Bangladesh becomes its own country. Pakistan is now in two parts. India has basically now got the balance of power in South Asia, which makes it a lot more stronger country than it was under Nehru. It gives it a lot more bargaining power, and therefore it makes India a lot more unreliable. So there's the tilt and then the movement of India from Nehru to Indira Gandhi in terms of balance of power. People question the non-alignment, right? Are you even non-aligned if you're signing a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the USSR in 1971? We saw the relationship between India and the US basically break down between Lyndon Johnson and Indira Gandhi, especially in the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. India did a big U-turn and basically just told the US off that we don't support you doing this. India became really close to North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and Nehru were very close buddies. They started the non-alignment movement. So there was this movement of India from becoming this newly independent young country to a more competent balance of power holder under Indira Gandhi. And therefore, questions were asked of India in terms of its intentions, in terms of its reliability, and in terms of its predictability. We don't know what big powers do.
But Teesta, do you think, I mean, it's hypothetical here, but do you think that lean towards the Soviet bloc, not formal inclusion within it, but the leaning, non-aligned to leaning left, do you think that was a benefit to India in the end, or do you think that was a missed opportunity because it didn't participate then in the liberal economic order, the economic development that came with free societies in the West, you didn't see in the Soviet bloc, in the communist world?
I mean, hindsight is 2020.
Yeah, of course.
But at the time, India was in desperate need of development and modernization, particularly in the defense sphere. And no one was, well, there were only two parties, but the US wasn't willing to give India the military hardware and technology that India needed to make sure that China doesn't encroach and Pakistan doesn't encroach.
Well, obviously not, given its concerns around India's reliability as a partner.
And that's an interesting point, right? That it wasn't always like that. In the beginning, when India was the largest aid recipient of Australia, US-India relationships are very tight. And Australia-India relationships were quite close because there was this mutual understanding of backing off China. And one could even argue that these were the same motivations that really pushed off relations in 2020 when China, during COVID lockdown, basically was salami slicing India's borders, continues to do that. But once the deal with the Russians were signed, or the tilt was made, automatically that put US and all of its allies and partners suspicion of India. India was a stalking horse. If you include it in any regional association, whether it be ASEAN or what have you, right? You're essentially inviting Russia into your region. And that thought lingers still. Those discussions linger still when you want to do a harder cooperation. For example, currently Quad is a soft cooperation. If you want to transition to a soft one, is that possible with India's relationship with Russia? I mean, of course, they're now slowly coming off of their massive reliance on Russia, moving to France, to Israel, Sweden, in terms of getting arms and arms manufacturing. But at that time, there weren't this many offers on the table, right? There were only 2 offers on the table, and one was not willing, and the other one that was, you take what you can get.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Let's rewind a bit, though, to those early Cold War years when India was the largest recipient of Australian aid. I think you said 2/3 of Australian aid was going to India. And it was the largest recipient of US aid too, is that right? So, I mean, this is amazing. I don't actually think that many people would appreciate how serious the commitment was of both the United States and Australia to India and its economic development. How did this come about? I mean, was this all about, if we help a country like India develop economically, it won't then fall into the arms of global communism? Was it just about strategic element, or was there a sort of humanitarian, we've both been British colonies, let's help each other type sentiment?
We can't ignore sentiment, and I'll come to that in a second. But largely it was this, from Canberra's perspective, there was this drive to gain strategic goodwill in India. Now, Australia knew that it will never be able to compete with the US aid or the multilateral banks or World Bank, the aid that it was giving to India. They knew that Australia will always be dwarfed when you're comparing. But comparison is a thief of joy. Australia was very, again, going back to the diplomats, right? R.G. Casey, who was the foreign minister between 1951 to 1960. He was also the governor of Bengal during 1944 to 1946.
And that would have been an appointment but the British made of him, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And he went straight from that to this role. And during his time in India, he was very close to Mahatma Gandhi. He was a key interlocutor between the Congress and the British government. He was very close to industrialists like G.D. Birla, Birla is still a very prominent industrialist family in India. He was very deeply understood what the needs of India are. And most importantly, he understood the difference between the West and India when it comes to development needs, when it comes to economic priorities, when it comes to how politics interlocks with policy. So he had a very nuanced understanding of India. And most importantly, he was the governor of Bengal when the famine happened and that killed about 1 million people at that time. It really made him understand the importance of agriculture. And he knew that that was the backbone of India's economy. And that is how Australia can come in and have this kind of this boutique aid set up, which will basically help the key priorities of India's development, which was essentially agriculture. So it was a time of basic necessities that India didn't have, that Australia was giving. And that essentially was because Australia was chasing this fungible goodwill strategy, right? And this goodwill strategy isn't ephemeral. It basically is trying to make sure that India doesn't stray to the communists.
Well, it's interesting in relation to Australia's ties with Japan in this exact same period. You see Australia signing the soft peace treaty with Japan and then by 1957 signing a commerce agreement with Japan, which is incredible. But with the same view that if you help Japan in its economic development and industrialization, then that would mean Japan is in the arms of the West and liberal democracies and not in the arms of the Soviet bloc and global communism. I mean, in Japan's case, it worked really well from Australia's perspective, but less so from the perspective of Australia when it came to India, despite all this unique insight that Richard Casey would have had into India and, I mean, the relationships, as you articulate, with politicians, with industrialists, with bureaucrats. I mean, that is amazing that our foreign minister at the time for 9 years had come with that perspective as governor of Bengal. And yet all those efforts, all that food aid, all that agricultural assistance ended up with Indira Gandhi tilting to the Soviets.
Casey, in his memoirs, he writes that he was so depressed by this pervasiveness of the Cold War mentality. I wouldn't say it was all to a waste, because you have to also understand the scale, right? That what Australia was giving in scale or in comparison to what the US and the World Bank were giving, 0.1% maybe. But essentially for India, what it needed under Indira Gandhi, the priorities changed, right? Her priority, as we learned from the 1971 war, was that military modernization, naval modernization. Military and defense became top priorities that perhaps the US and its allies weren't willing to help out on. I just wanted to come back to emotions, right? That we talk about sentiments. And Australia's story is very much an emotional story. And you could say the same about Menzies' relationship, right? Like I said, initially, he was hell-bent on trying to get a Kashmir. So you have to understand that trying to get a Kashmir consensus between India and Pakistan is very difficult. It's emotionally fraught. It's historically muddled. And there is technically no solution, which is where we are now. But he gave it his best shot. Australia's drive towards India has always been about this dream. I had a very prominent journalist in Australia tell me that the India-Australia relationship is the boulevard of broken dreams, because it always starts off on this dreamy note of solutions and pragmatism, but dwindled with that this will be a promise that will be fulfilled, but it never is.
Nehru dies in office in 60, you're going to correct me, 64, and Menzies retires in 66. And by this stage, the aid relationship is much diminished from the early years of the Cold War, isn't it? It was pretty much as the US-India relationship was souring, Australia also started to withdraw away from supporting India and, of course, replace that with Indonesia. But tell me, once it wasn't Nehru and Menzies up against each other and the leaders had changed, what was the quality of the relationship?
I think the next tie-up came between Whitlam and Indira Gandhi. So they both visit each other quite often, or Indira visited in, I think, 68, and then Whitlam visited in 73. At this point, because remember, again, in 1971, India signs the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with the USSR. India's already become the sole kind of balance of power in South Asia because it's sliced up Pakistan into two parts. The discussions of the 1971 treaty, however, started all the way back in 1969. And it is not a surprise that that's when the aid to India was cut. Because, and this is again, when historians work, we may not find the smoking gun, but what I found was that Arthur Tang, who was the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and is then shipped off to Delhi, he's Australia's High Commissioner to India, he wrote letters back to headquarters, I'm going to call it DFAT, but essentially saying that there's no longer the optimism that there once was in the relationship. Indira Gandhi's swift deterioration with the US, her falling out with Lyndon Johnson, India calling out the unfavorable positions of its stance towards the US's presence in Vietnam, its growing prominence in the subcontinent, basically led to Tang realizing that why are we throwing all our money here? Again, I'm saying that Australia is sending its best diplomats, and diplomats can sense things go wrong before things go wrong. So Tang essentially wrote back in 68 saying, we need to bring back our attention closer to home. Remember, this is 1963 to 1966. The Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation is happening. And Tang very quickly realized that a destabilized Indonesia is much more worrisome for Australia than a poor India because it's so much closer to home, right? He understands the proximity of geography and the lack of optimism in India. And that's why the aid is cut. That's why relationships not become bitter, but they just become estranged.
Yeah.
So
I think it's interesting, Arthur Tang, as you said, the Secretary of External Affairs, very senior Australian diplomat. I found it interesting you quote his letter and his assessment of Gandhi's foreign policy approach. He says that compared to Nehru's approach, that India's foreign policy is becoming more realistic, unsentimental, egocentric in its intentions, even if occasionally wayward in its execution. So this sense that there's no harking back to shared values or shared political systems, democracy, and that we can at least look upon things like cricket as something we share from our British colonial past. I think Gandhi was quoting in her speech to the Bombay Congress Party Convention in 1969, she quoted Viscount Palmerston, who dominated British foreign policy at the height of its imperial power, saying, "We have no eternal allies and no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." Trying to say that India will chart its own course and determine what its interests are, and they would just be purely Indian, construed by Indians, for Indians. But the reality was that she was leading India really to a Soviet alignment, but without saying it explicitly.
And therein lies the difference between Nehru's non-alignment versus Indira's non-alignment. Nehru's non-alignment was about idealism, was about development, was about working that middle path because India didn't fit in. But Indira's non-alignment was about hardcore realism, hardcore realpolitik, about the survival of the self is the utmost importance. And the domestic politics at that time in India were quite fraught because this was a time where development wasn't put as a key priority, because while there was the 5-year plans happening, but defense was now seen as India's defense, whether that be through breaking up Pakistan or signing up with the USSR, that was a key priority. Don't forget that in 1962, India had just come out of a terrible war with China. So India had a very depleted international standing, as a defense nation. So for Indira, that became priority. The deals with the USSR were made, but if you look at it from a very pure realistic perspective, she did what she had to do for survival.
But prioritising defence spending and build-up of forces, making that the number one national priority, presumably came at the expense of economic development and feeding a nation that was pretty hungry.
Precisely. And at the same time, some aid programs were stopped because of India's alignment with the USSR. So it wasn't that was helping situation. This was also the time that India was investing heavily in its space organization. 1974 was when India tested its first nuclear weapon. And so you can clearly tell priorities are changing. In 1998, when India tested its official nuclear weapons, Australia was one of the first countries that came out against it. But I think this change in priority is very important to understand the difference in what was happening with Australia-India relations. That when India was poised to be bettering its development status, pulling people out of below poverty line, Australia was standing with India. But when the priorities changed, Australia no longer felt that it was something that they could align themselves with. And therefore, we saw the aid being cut.
Fast forward to today, how much do we still grapple with the overhang of this period, this Gandhi, McMahon, Gandhi Holt, Gandhi Gorton period, and that decline really in relations and that sense that India is strategically pretty unreliable?
Look, I think a lot has changed in the Australia-India relationship. One could say it's because of China, that Australia's relationship with China and India's relationship with China have caused Australia and India to come closer. One could say it's because India is now the fastest growing migrant group in Australia. India is now a much bigger economy than it was in the Cold War. And one of the things that when Indonesia replaced India as the largest recipient, one of the reasons was because Indonesia was a friendlier place for foreign capital investment, which India wasn't because of its economy. I think the answer lies in the economy. The third pillar, the trade pillar, the India Free Trade Agreement, have the ECTA come out, and hopefully the free trade agreement will come out soon. I think unless that is strengthened, no amount of security or people-to-people ties will really keep the momentum going. And that's a very difficult ask. I completely understand why it's so difficult for Australia and India to do an Australia and China, right? Everyone loves to talk about how India is the new China. It makes me really uncomfortable. But I think fundamentally, Australia and India are very uncomplementary economies, right? They're both trying to protect their agriculture. And that's just the starting point. So unless there is another Australian government trying to really build that third pillar, the economic pillar, Australia and India are regional partners, right? They're the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific, if you want to call it that. They've got Southeast Asia in the middle, and the Quad is trying to really get to work to make sure the Southeast Asia is on board with this relationship. But the answer lies in trying to really shore up economic interests.
I think with the massive increase in interest from Indians in moving to Australia, studying here and becoming Australian citizens, that gives Australians so many more opportunities to get to know India and Indian culture and way of life and thinking, and that cross assimilation. Indian migrants are assimilating into Australia, but Australians also are assimilating into an Australia that comprises of Indian migrants, and that getting to know each other through that way, I think, can be quite powerful, but it doesn't necessarily feature on the DFAT website. Of course, it's not going to be a free trade agreement worthy moment, but that culturally, I think, is incredibly important. And we are very lucky to have you here in Australia, Teesta, to explain the whole historical context to us. So thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.